So I'm still in need to clean the tang on this short walloon-hilted sword that we saw a few videos ago. But so there's no real update on the sword itself. But if you've seen my previous videos where I talked about this sword, you'll know that I was always in a little bit of doubt as to what this sword would have been originally, because it is considerably smaller and shorter than what you would normally expect on a walloon-hilted sword. That kind of always puzzled me a little. Today we're going to maybe, well, speculate a little bit on what this may have been, because while doing some research for another sword, I kind of stumbled onto some information that maybe gives us an answer as to what this is. And the research I was doing is specifically on this, which at a first glance may seem like a completely different sword or something that is really unrelated to this. However, that may not be the case. This is a 1747 Prussian Dragoon sword. We're not going to talk about it in detail now. I just wanted to show it because it's the reason that got me thinking about the walloon hilt. So essentially, while researching this sword, I came to understand that this was a modern answer to developing needs for the way Dragoon combat was performed. So they needed a heavier, bigger sword. So what Dragoons were using before the 1747 model, and even earlier with its older sibling, the 1734 model, was a sword that did not follow necessarily any pattern or regulation as you see develop with subsequent models. So they basically had a sword as a sidearm, and this sword is described in quite some detail in the book Me Fecit Potzsdam by Bernd Windsheimer. So let me read a little excerpt of how this earlier sword is described. So keep in mind this is a Google translation because I don't speak German. So there may be some inconsistencies, one of which I was able to spot, but others perhaps not. So just to give some historical context here, it seems that after the death of King Frederick I in 1713, Dragoon troops had been kind of overlooked. In fact, it seems like the new king, Frederick Wilhelm I, had actually increased the amount of troops for all other units in the army, but Dragoons had remained at the 6th regiment that they had been previously, and their equipment had not changed. So it's already interesting because we see that apparently then Dragoons in the early 1700s were still using a kind of equipment or sword that hadn't been modernized as of yet. So it is consistent with the fact that they may have been using swords that were more popular in the 1600s. Now coming to the description, there may be some inconsistencies because I'm using Google Translate to translate from German, which I don't speak. So if there's anything that seems out of whack, it may be that, and please feel free to correct me. King Frederick Wilhelm I increased the number of troops in almost all units. However, the number of 6 dragoon regiments remained unchanged, an expression of how little the soldier king paid to this unit, probably how little attention or care he paid to this unit. For a long time, the use of swords was probably parallel to that of the Reuter, as the cuirassiers were formerly called. So even here we see a parallel between how the dragoons would have been used and the cuirassiers, which actually comes back later in the model 1847, but let's not get sidetracked. This means that the sidearm around 1700 consisted of a dagger. This is the word Google Translate added, but the German word that Windsheimer uses is Haudegen, which coincidentally is the same word that is used often in German for the walloon-hilted sword. The iron hilt of which consisted of 2 kidney-shaped guards and a wooden wire handle, a main bow, 2 side bows, a thumb ring, and a round pommel. So if we look at the walloon-hilted sword I'm holding here, or actually maybe we should call it a Haudegen, we can definitely see a lot of characteristics that are common to what is being described. So we see these 2 kidney guards. I assume he's talking about, I hope you see them, but yeah, basically the pierced guards on the hilt. We see 2 main branches and then a third one connecting here. We see a round pommel. And, well, we don't see it here because it's been removed, but I have it here. There is a, well, this one isn't wrapped in wire, but I assure you there are some signs of the wire wrapping there. Wire-wrapped wooden grip. But why is what I'm saying now relevant to this specific walloon-hilted sword, which is a short one, and not to any other walloon-hilted sword, which would kind of make more sense when talking about use for cavalry? In fact, if you remember my previous videos, I always assumed that this sword may have been used on ships rather than on land, because its short size lends really well to it being used in close quarters, and we know that these kinds of swords did exist on ships. Well, there's an interesting follow-up in the book which kind of seems to describe this sword in even more detail. When Friedrich Wilhelm I came to power in 1713, the sword hilts were probably made of brass. This one, of course, isn't. It's iron or steel. So what we have so far is interesting because it's a description of a walloon hilt sword being used by Prussian dragoons pre-1713 or pre-King Friedrich Wilhelm I. Friedrich Wilhelm does introduce apparently a new sword for the dragoons, which is a brass hilt sword, which is not this yet, because this final version you'll find in the model 1734. However, it's an intermediate version between these. And I think when you observe them, you can actually see how similar this actually is to a walloon-hilted sword. It is bigger, it is heavier, the branches are more flat, so it feels more closed and protective. But essentially, it's not in any way different from a walloon-hilted sword. So we don't know much about this intermediate brass-hilted model because I don't think there are any extant complete versions of this sword in existence. But there are parts of them, so according to the book, we can kind of reconstruct what they looked like. And it's in the description of the blade of this intermediate evolution of the old sword of the dragoons that this blade and this sword becomes really interesting beyond simply having a hilt that matches what dragoons used to use. So if I read here, yes, the blades were, at least at the beginning of the 1720s, relatively short, less than 80 centimeters and double-edged. And he then describes how the blades, which later became superfluous and were often rhombic in cross-section, were used up to the early 1840s for early versions of the artillery saber. Now, what is really interesting here, I think, is that when describing the blade of this intermediate version of the modernized sword of the dragoons, which comes basically between a traditional walloon and a final version of the dragoon sword, the blade he's describing is very, very reminiscent of the one I have on this walloon-hilted specifically. So he talks about a short blade, often under 80 centimeters. This one is even shorter. This one is really on the short side because the blade is 65 centimeters. But it's not really that far from what he's describing. It's a short blade with a double edge, so this matches, and with a rhombic section. So I don't know if you can tell from there, but this is definitely a rhombic section. And I've also discussed in previous videos comparing different walloon-hilted swords how this is a bit of an outlier because most typical walloon-hilted swords will have a lenticular blade with a short fuller at the forte here. This is very unusual and it's something I haven't seen before. So what this whole thing now makes me think is that perhaps this blade he's describing that was used on these intermediate Prussian dragoon swords may have taken its inspiration from the old sword of the Prussian dragoons, which is something from his description that may be very, very similar to this, if not this exact kind of sword. So I just thought it would be really interesting to show you and talk about because I've been puzzled for so long by the size of this sword and by the unusual shape profile, this cross-section I mean, and I haven't really been able to make up speculation that was backed by anything, if not the fact that these were used on ships, as I mentioned. But now suddenly there is enough information that a kind of informed speculation can be made. And I'm really leaning now to the fact that this may be a early, so this is certainly a 17th century sword, but this may be the kind of sword that Prussian or maybe other German states dragoons were using as their sidearm before their way of warfare evolved to them needing more of a palish kind of sword. So I just thought it would be interesting to share with you, and I'm very curious to what your thoughts are. Do you agree? Do you think, do you have any insights on this? If there's any Prussian regulation, 18th century regulation expert, I would really love to hear from you. But this is where I currently stand in my interpretation of this sword. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon in another sword video.